When the Vatican bells rang that morning, they did not announce a mass. They tolled like sirens, shrill, panicked, unnatural. And then came the sound no house of worship was ever built to endure, the clash of rifle butts against ancient wooden doors, the bark of orders given in haste, the breathless thunder of boots on sacred marble. The army had come. Uniformed, armed, and certain of their rightness, they marched into the Basilica of St. Damasus. One of the holiest sanctuaries of the Catholic world, not to worship, not to repent, but to arrest the Pope himself. Pope Leo XIV stood before the altar, draped in white robes that suddenly looked more like a target than a vestment. He did not flinch. He did not step back. He simply watched as the men approached, his eyes steady, unshaken, as though he had foreseen this moment long ago. They believed they were storming a building. But what they entered was not mere stone and glass. It was a living memory of 2,000 years of sacred resistance. They came to break a man. But they touched something unbreakable. And in that hour of unholy intrusion, just as hands reached for the arm of the pontiff, a voice rose from the shadows. It was not loud. It did not need to be. Because it carried the weight of heaven behind it. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle stepped forward, his cassock still trailing incense from morning prayers. He did not shield the Pope. He stood beside him. Like a brother before a firing squad, like a prophet before a throne. And then he spoke. What he said would not stop the soldiers' march. It would stop their hearts. What he said would not turn back the weapons. It would turn the eyes of the world. What he said, would leave even generals in tears. So before we begin this telling, ask yourself, if you had been there that morning. If your body trembled while rifles rose and prophets stood still. Would you have had the courage to stand? Or the comfort to walk away? Tell us, where in the world are you watching this from? Subscribe to God's message for souls, not for stories, but for awakenings. He was not the kind of Pope history books expect. There were no sweeping declarations from balconies, no choreographed parades through crowded squares. Pope Leo XIV moved differently, quiet as breath, deliberate as a candle lit in morning. He was the first pontiff to walk the ruins of Aleppo after the bombs fell. The first to kneel in silence beside mothers who held nothing but photographs. The first to visit not only prisons, but the prisoners no nation dared to claim. Where others had issued decrees, he listened. Where others built walls, he opened windows. Where others sought applause, he sought the forgotten. And it was that silence, dangerous, holy, unwavering, that drew the fury of men who feared what cannot be controlled. Just days before the soldiers came, Pope Leo had released a letter that did not name names, but exposed them all the same. A scathing, sorrowful encyclical that dared to name sin where it hid behind suits and robes. He wrote of power that poisons. Of wealth that silences. Of altars built on the backs of the poor. He did not accuse. He simply held up a mirror. And the world did what guilty men always do when shown their own reflection, they called it rebellion. Beside him, another figure had already become a target. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. He was not born into Vatican politics. He rose from classrooms, not conclaves. From marketplaces in Manila, not marble palaces. They called him the people's cardinal, not as a compliment, but as a warning. He had a way of making even the rich feel small, and the broken feel seen. He preached in whispers. He wept during homilies. And he listened longer than most were willing to speak. But in his silence, too, there was fire. The world had long suspected that it would not be a mob or a scandal that would test this papacy, it would be something colder. More coordinated. And when it came, it did not wear rage. It wore uniforms. A state-backed military operation. Legitimized by legislation. Fueled by a growing secular movement that had declared spiritual authority to be incompatible with national progress. They called it an emergency action. A mission to detain the pontiff for questioning. But the orders were drafted long before the encyclical. Long before the basilica. Long before the prayers that were interrupted that day. The sanctuary was full. Not just of believers. But of watchers, journalists, diplomats, silent skeptics waiting to see what would happen when truth was finally dragged into the street. This moment was no accident. It was choreographed. It was meant to shame. It was meant to show the world that even shepherds could be muzzled. But no one, accounted for what a quiet pope and a tearful cardinal could do, without lifting a single hand. The lead officer did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Clad in crisp green fatigues, with medals gleaming like gilt across his chest, he stepped past the trembling altar boys and stood before the pontiff as if the church were a courtroom, and he, its judge. His voice was cold, calculated, rehearsed. Your Holiness, intelligence reports confirm that your chambers have harbored individuals deemed subversive to national stability. Would you deny you are shielding political dissidents? The basilica held its breath. Some looked toward the exit. Others toward the heavens. But Pope Leo XIV did not shift. He did not sigh. He simply lifted his eyes, ancient and unwavering, to meet the man's stare. We do not shield dissidents, he said. We shield the abandoned. The forgotten. Those whose only crime is being inconvenient to power. The officer blinked, caught off guard not by the reply, but by the absence of fear in it. There was no deflection. No plea. Only truth, spoken in a tone too still to argue with. Cardinal Tagle, seated near the second row of bishops, said nothing. His hands rested gently in his lap, but his fingers trembled with something deeper than fear, recognition. He had seen this before. In the faces of mothers whose children disappeared. In the eyes of priests before exile. In the moments just before injustice tried to dress itself as law. The officer moved to phase 2 of the script. He produced papers, unsealed and annotated, a collection of names, receipts, correspondence, half-truths wrapped in the appearance of due process. Then what of these? He pressed. You personally offered sanctuary to 3 individuals accused of orchestrating resistance efforts against the state. Your name is on the log. Your seal is on the gate. A murmur passed through the room like wind through reeds. But the Pope did not blink. He looked at the pages. He did not flinch. He only whispered, so softly it seemed the walls themselves leaned in to listen, what you call resistance, we call mercy. The officer stiffened. He had expected resistance, not reverence. He had expected denial, not defiant compassion. Your Holiness, he said, his voice sharpening, this is not theology. These are state matters. But Leo's response was neither political nor poetic. It was pastoral. And devastating. The state sees borders. The church sees wounds. And when the wounded cry out, we open our doors, not to defy the state, but to obey heaven. The silence that followed did not come from respect. It came from confusion. How does one argue with a man who has already counted the cost? How do you threaten a shepherd who has already laid down his life? Tagle lowered his head, but not in shame. In sorrow. He knew what was coming. He could see the hands tightening at the officer's side. He could feel the weight in the room begin to shift, from legality to violence. From questions to commands. And yet, the Pope remained. Like an old olive tree in a storm. Bent. Weathered. Rooted in something deeper than fear. If your conscience stirred even once during these words, subscribe to God's message for souls right now. The officer no longer spoke like a man presenting charges. Now he spoke like one preparing for judgment. His jaw had tightened. The script was unraveling. This was no longer a ceremonial reprimand, it was a confrontation between power and something it could not intimidate. He stepped closer. close enough that his breath touched the edge of the Pope's vestments. "This church," he said, "has repeatedly acted against the interests of the state. You have harbored traitors. You've published letters that erode confidence in leadership. You've opened your doors to cowards and criminals." He paused, voice rising with manufactured righteousness. "You have undermined national security." The words echoed in the sanctuary like a curse hurled across holy ground. For the first time, Pope Leo's eyes closed. Not in weariness, but in remembering. And when he opened them again, they held not defiance, but grief. A deep, sacred grief. "Security?" he asked, his voice breaking open the silence like a slow thunder. "Let me tell you about security." He stepped down from the altar. His voice lowered, not from fear, but from reverence. 2 years ago, I entered a border town in the dead of night. No cameras. No escort. Only the moon, and the cries of a mother holding a child who had taken his last breath minutes before I arrived. His father had been executed for speaking a word of protest. His brother was taken to a camp. He had inhaled smoke from the rubble that your drones had left behind. The Pope looked up now, and the weight of that memory held the room still. I baptized him with tears and river water. He could not speak, but his eyes asked me one question: does God still love me, even if no one else will? "You speak of security," Leo whispered. "But what good is a nation safe from bombs, if it is not safe for a child to hope?" The officer faltered. Not visibly, but inwardly. Something inside him recoiled. And it was in that fragile crack, that trembling pause, that Cardinal Tagle stood. Not as a shield. Not as a witness. But as a man who could no longer sit in silence while sacred memory was turned into political ammunition. He leaned toward the bishop beside him and whispered a single sentence. The bishop rose and walked to the side chapel. Tagle walked forward, each step pulled by a quiet fire beneath his robes. The soldiers shifted uneasily, unsure whether this was protocol, or prophecy. He said nothing yet. But his face was already speaking. Controlled anguish. Not because he feared what was coming, but because he had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that the world had learned enough from its last crucifixion. Pope Leo turned to the officer again, who now stood at the edge of something he could neither name nor control. "We are not your enemies," Leo said, and his voice did not rise. "We are your conscience." The words hung in the air like incense, heavy, piercing, inescapable. And for the first time, the soldiers did not look at the Pope. They looked at the officer. Not for orders, but for meaning. If that stirred something buried deep within you, subscribe now to God's message for souls. The officer's composure began to fracture, subtly, but unmistakably. His voice, once crisp and deliberate, now trembled beneath its own weight. "Are you saying," he asked, struggling to contain his fury behind formality, "that your church is above the law?" The words fell hard, but they did not land. Pope Leo XIV took a breath, slow and sacred. His hands did not rise. His tone did not sharpen. He simply looked into the man's face with the gaze of someone who had seen too much of this world to be shaken by its threats. "No," he said. "I am saying the soul is above orders." That silence, the kind of silence that crushes lesser men, filled the basilica like rising water. No one moved. Not a breath dared break it. For a moment, even time itself bowed its head. Then came the sound that was not a command, not a prayer, but something heavier. The soft rustle of robes. Cardinal Tagle. He stepped from behind the rows of clergy, walked with steady feet and trembling grace, and stood beside the Pope, not as a subordinate, not as a diplomat, but as a brother in the shadow of the cross. He placed a hand on Leo's shoulder. Not protectively, but sacramentally. "You will not take this man alone," Tagle said. His voice did not rise, yet it rang louder than the general's commands. I walk with him, as Christ walked with those condemned. There were no gasps. Only tears. Even among those who came in uniform. Outside the basilica, the crowd that had gathered in confusion began to witness history without knowing it. Cameras pointed. Voices whispered into microphones. But the only moment that mattered was the one that did not need a caption. Because when two men, clothed in white and red, stood together beneath the crucifix, something eternal entered the room. The live streams exploded. In Rome, Manila, Lagos, Buenos Aires, screens lit up like stained glass catching fire. Some wept. Some raged. But all watched. And in that moment, the church was no longer a building. It was a question, a living, breathing question posed not to governments, but to the conscience of every man. Pope Leo looked at the officer now, not as an accuser, but as a shepherd still hoping the lost might return. To arrest love, he said, is to make truth louder. He did not say it to win. He said it because it had already been written. On every martyr's tomb. On every forgotten saint's breath. On every heart that still believed mercy was stronger than steel. The officer swallowed hard. Behind him, the soldiers did not advance. They stood frozen, not by fear, but by something they had never trained for. Conviction. Subscribe now, stand beside the voices who stand alone. The tension, once hard and serrated like a drawn blade, began to change its shape. It didn't vanish. It deepened. Became something heavier, more personal, like the weight of a sin remembered too late. From the side aisle of the sanctuary, a Vatican official, elderly, discreet, and silent until now, stepped forward holding a folder bound in crimson ribbon. He did not speak. He simply laid the contents on the altar, where the chalice had once rested. It was not theology. It was not metaphor. It was evidence. Documents, financial records, encrypted correspondences, all detailing a network of financial deceit. Shell accounts. Redirected aid. Blood money disguised as infrastructure. And at the center of it, names. Names belonging not to the church, but to those who now surrounded her with rifles and rhetoric. Military elites. Civil liaisons. Silent benefactors in tailored suits. The Pope had not authored a manifesto. He had written a mirror. And in it, the powerful had seen themselves. And panicked. The lead officer stared at the documents. His throat tightened. His hands twitched. The weight of the truth was no longer metaphorical. It was printed. It was real. And it was damning. Pope Leo stepped forward once more, his voice neither triumphant nor bitter. Only wounded. Do you arrest prophets because they lie? Or because they tell the truth, too loudly? He did not look at the officer with anger. He looked at him the way a physician looks at a patient who has hidden the disease for too long. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. Because no script had been written for this moment. No training had prepared him to confront not a rebellion, but a revelation. And then came the voice that turned the silence into thunder. Cardinal Tagle stepped forward again, facing the soldiers directly. He did not raise his hands. He did not demand. He simply asked a question. One that peeled back the armor far deeper than their vests ever could. If you believe we are dangerous, he said softly, then ask yourselves, why does mercy terrify your masters? A pause. And then, one by one, the rifles began to drop. Not loudly, but reverently. Like confessions whispered into wood. It was not a revolt. It was an awakening. The youngest soldier was the first to kneel. Then another. Then 3 more. Outside, the watching crowd, growing by the thousands, began to sing. Not in protest. But in prayer. The melody was old. Simple. It rose like incense, weaving through the air, through the shattered illusion of control, through the wounded dignity of power. Inside the basilica, something ancient returned. Not victory, but truth, unhindered, unveiled, and unafraid. The officer, once upright, now broken in posture, looked not at the Pope, but at the floor. And for a fleeting second, he seemed like every man who had ever stood on the wrong side of a holy moment. And realized it too late. The silence inside the basilica had changed. It was no longer the silence of fear or tension. It was the silence that follows revelation, the kind of stillness that demands nothing but reverence. The rifles lay abandoned near marble columns now. The soldiers stood unarmed, not by force, but by choice. As if the truth had done what bullets never could. Pope Leo XIV walked slowly across the sanctuary floor, his steps echoing between arches carved by centuries of prayer and suffering. He stopped before the youngest soldier, the one who had knelt first. From beneath his robe, the Pope drew something simple. Worn. Familiar. A wooden rosary, its beads dulled by time, its crucifix cracked at the edge. He took the soldier's hand and placed it within. This belonged to Father Romero, he said, voice tender as a requiem. He died praying for his enemies. Not because he agreed with them, but because he refused to forget they were still souls. The soldier's fingers closed around the beads like a drowning man reaching for air. Then Pope Leo turned, slowly, deliberately, and faced the room, a room no longer marked by confrontation, but by a fragile, sacred clarity. This, he said, is not a war of uniforms, but of values. Not a battle of bullets, but of blindness. And when we choose to see again, when we choose to feel again, we do not win. We return. He paused. The moment hung between heaven and earth. And then, as if handed a torch, Cardinal Tagle turned to face the cameras now trained on him from across the world. His voice trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of what needed to be said. To those watching around the world, he began, don't see this as heroism. See it as a reminder. That faith does not hide. It kneels, even when surrounded. There were no cries of triumph. No victory chants. Only weeping. From soldiers. From clergy. From strangers standing in the square with their hands pressed against the iron gates. And in that final act, Pope Leo raised his right hand, not in defense. Not in resistance. But in blessing. He traced the sign of the cross in the air, his fingers slow and deliberate, as if painting light upon darkness. And as he whispered the words, "May the peace of Christ remain with you all," the hush fell so deep upon the basilica, even time seemed to kneel. What would you have done, if you stood in that church beside Pope Leo XIV and Cardinal Tagle? Would you have bowed your head and waited for it all to pass? Would you have watched the soldiers enter and told yourself it wasn't your place? Would you have told your conscience to hush, and called it wisdom? Or would you have stood? Not because it was safe. Not because it was easy. But because the moment demanded more of your soul than silence could ever offer. Because in every generation, there comes a day, quiet at first, when truth is dragged into the light by trembling hands. When mercy is mistaken for rebellion. When love is led away in handcuffs, and only those with eyes to see know it is Christ who is being arrested again. And when that day comes, there will be no neutral ground. Only those who remembered. And those who looked away. So we ask you now. Not as spectators, but as souls, would you have stood with them? Would you have knelt beside a pope who refused to betray the broken? Would you have spoken the words that mercy demanded, even when power was listening? Would you have believed, still, that the gospel is stronger than guns? We do not tell these stories to impress. We tell them to awaken. May we all seek truth with humble hearts. And may your soul not leave this channel unchanged. Subscribe to God's message for souls. Not for stories, but for awakenings. Still won't? Then we ask one last thing, enter the comments and answer, what truth here stirred or scared you the most today?